DARPA really sort of invented the modern computing world and computer internet in a really profound way. It's more than just funding it. There were three men, not just J.C.R. Licklider, who in '61 wrote this essay called Man-Machine Symbiosis, which was really a roadmap for everything we have today. I mean, you have to go back and read it. It's just essential. Not just the part about this tight coupling, which may or may not happen, but it really sketches out where the computer industry has gone since that time. And then, of course, his protege, Robert Taylor, who I think was really instrumental in seeing and the possibility and funding the ARPANET, played an absolutely instrumental role. And also Ivan Sutherland passed through DARPA at an early point. And those three guys, it was not just funding it. They had a vision of what computing should be. And indeed, with Licklider, with Taylor, wrote a piece in '65 called "The Computer as a Communications Device," which laid out the roadmap for the ARPANET and then the internet. And I can't tell you how many. I mean, I wrote the first story about Sun Microsystems, which was an invention of DARPA. I wrote the first story about Silicon Graphics, which is an invention of DARPA. There are so many companies and technologies in Silicon Valley are DARPA foreseen and derived. So they shaped an earlier era, and so we should look very carefully at what they're doing now to see what computing might offer us in the way of tools in the future. I think we're going to start with Brian talking briefly about some of the current projects that he's involved with and that might have an impact on the kinds of systems that the people who govern and communities might be able to use in the future, and then we'll come back and talk about things. And at a certain point, I'm going to turn it open to you, and we'll let you guys drive and see where things will go. But I have lots of questions about DARPA. I've been covering DARPA for many years. So go ahead, Brian.
Well, thanks so much, John. I must say I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very stimulating summit. It's fantastic. And it's a little different certainly for us at DARPA. We tend to go more on the science and engineering side, so this is a great expansion. But it's very DARPA. It's worth to just pause a bit and just talk about what our mission is. We see it today, and it's a broad one. And then what I prepared in terms of thoughts on programs relevant to data and information, since that was seen so central to the theme of this summit, in particular relating to knowledge. So DARPA's mission is to prevent and create technological surprise for national security. It's a pretty interesting mission. Has a lot of expectations associated with it, which we try to live up to. National security was much less complex in the days of the Soviet Union, where we could focus our attention on a single superpower adversary. But since the fall of the Berlin Wall over 25 years ago, we've seen the emergence of a multitude of what we call non-traditional threats to national security that are highly sophisticated in how they exploit global information resources and infrastructure. These threats, in particular non-state actors, including terrorist organizations and criminal networks, engage in covert activities like human trafficking, arms smuggling, and money laundering. They also can be overt, such as in activities like fundraising and recruitment, which in themselves do not really generally raise suspicions, but actually are very critical elements to their operations. So the global information ecosystem is a very powerful enabler, though, for the world and the betterment of the world. We at DARPA recognize the challenge in addressing the use of this ecosystem by the relatively few threats while nurturing the beneficence of the ecosystem for the many. So we seek to help counter the bad while fostering the good in the global information ecosystem by developing technologies that aim to provide guarantees for data and information in three critical areas. 1, transparency. 2, privacy. And 3, trust. Now, I also believe these three are actually very fundamental to good governance in general. The achievement of all three guarantees is one of many complex problems that we tackle, in which we believe technology solutions can help resolve what seem to be intractable policy challenges. So I'll now describe 3 programs that represent our efforts to provide transparency, ensure privacy, and enable trust. The first program is making data on the internet more transparent. This program is called MEMX, and it is developing software that extends online search to include automated focus searches in the deep and dark parts of the public web. So the deep web is the non-indexed web. It has forums. It has very transient type web pages and the like. And then the dark web tends to be associated with the anonymized web, where the onion router is well known in that regard. So the ability to explore those domains, and you can see it particularly in light of one is interested in threats, but I do want to emphasize the anonymized web has a lot of good aspects to it in terms of how does it enable an individual living in a totalitarian or authoritarian regime to be able to access the web in an anonymous manner. MEMX technologies, as an example, though, are being used today to uncover and defeat human trafficking enterprises. These technologies specifically have enabled actually 26 cases, 8 prosecutions, and 1 conviction to date, and have been recognized by the New York City District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. and by the New Jersey State Police. Again, this is an interesting sort of spreading of what DARPA can do, even though its mission certainly is focused on defense. We take this broader view going back to this whole picture of what constitutes threats to national security. We have started a program named Brandeis that seeks to enable safe and predictable data sharing in which privacy is preserved. Louis Brandeis is the inspiration for this program, and there's a very particular reason. He's well known for a paper he wrote in Harvard Law Review. It was titled The Right to Privacy, and it's considered a seminal paper in this domain. What's interesting when you read it, he refers to instantaneous photography as being an intrusion of privacy, sort of the forerunner of Kodak's instamatic cameras. So again, over 100 years later, we still see what technology is doing today in terms of privacy, and in that respect, it isn't seen as particularly a new aspect. So Brandeis is the inspiration for the program. What it is doing, it is developing the technical means to protect private and proprietary information of individuals and enterprises. The vision of the program is to A, maintain privacy, and B, be able to tap the huge value of data. So rather than trying to balance these two sort of almost opposing objectives, the program seeks again to towards really a third option where truly we can have data shared by all and preserving the privacy of the individual. The program is just getting started. We have no miracles to share with you today, but there's interesting approaches being pursued, such as this concept of differential privacy, where if the case is one of big data, the individual now is being asked to take responsibility actually for their data, and there's a whole interesting question of human data interface in this case. And so now someone comes to them and says, I'd like to use your data for some public health application. It's part of a big group. The question can be so what is the kind of distribution that you expect to get? What uncertainty might be associated with that? And hence the kind of data that I individually will provide, I'd like to fuzz it enough so that's within that uncertainty. So again, it's really tailoring now the data I give to the particular need. Another one is maybe certain types of encryption, which is a little more challenging. But there's new encryption today where data can be encrypted. I can send it to a third party that they don't need to encrypt it. They can operate on it and send it back encrypted. And so I'm good, right? Problem with that is that approach, it's a technique called fully homomorphic encryption, has a very demanding overhead of about 10 to the 14th. But what DARPA did with a program called Proceed, it looked to knock that down to about 10 to the 6th, which put it perhaps in the realm of more supercomputing capability. But that gives us hope that perhaps we can achieve this ideal of sharing data and yet preserving privacy. And there's a whole new interesting question of the human data interface in sort of parallel to the human-computer interface. So the potential impact of such a program certainly would be dramatic. And as an example, assured data privacy is certainly fundamental to the achievement of personal medicine. I've spoken about transparency and privacy. And now I'd just like to talk a bit about trust in online media. So consumer imaging technologies, digital cameras, mobile phones, and the like certainly have become ubiquitous. And it is estimated that an average of 1.8 billion images and videos were uploaded daily to social media over the course of 2014. At the same time, a growing proportion of this visual media was manipulated. Now, most manipulations are benign for fun, artistic reasons, but some can be used for adversarial purposes, like propaganda or misinformation campaigns. Today's forensic tools to detect manipulation really lack robustness and scalability and only address some aspects of media authentication. There does not exist a single end-to-end system that can perform a complete and automated forensic analysis of these media. So we've just started a program called Metaphor. It stands for Media Forensics, and its objective is to level the playing field, which currently really favors the image manipulator. And the intent here is to develop automated techniques that would determine the integrity of an image or a video. Now, we're talking on interesting subjects here, which really, like privacy, integrity, related to trust, where we don't really have well-defined metrics. And actually, in both of those two programs, Brandeis and Metaphor, one important objective is defining metrics that allow us to make these kinds of assessments. And that's, again, we'll wait and see how that all plays out. So again, we're certainly very aware of the tension that arises through the simultaneous pursuit of transparency, privacy, and trust for data and information in the global information ecosystem. Our work in this domain will not necessarily solve this dilemma, but we hope our advances will make it easier to satisfy the interests and needs of everyone who really want to make the web a force for good.
Thank you. That's a good introduction. Let's start very high level. My sort of assertion that DARPA had this impact on transforming the computing world beginning in the 1960s, and sort of the question we can pose today is, does DARPA have something of that scale to offer the world? You pointed out when we were talking before we started that there was no computer industry in the world before, and now it's a very different situation. From being inside DARPA, what does it look like in terms of, does the agency have a role to play on the scale that it did in the 1960s?
So we think we do, and yet things have changed quite a bit when we see the tremendous investment and interest in the commercial domain. At the time, in the 60s and 70s, there really wasn't a comparable development. Yes, people started to pick up on what was happening at DARPA and elsewhere. DARPA doesn't have a monopoly. And by the way, DARPA has no labs or infrastructure. It's a group of program managers who come for about 4 to 5 years. Really, the whole business model is churned to develop new ideas. Nonetheless, at that period, it was sort of open territory. Today, of course, we see a tremendous activity in the commercial sector, and it drives us ever harder to get an understanding of what is the current state of the art so that we can find those domains that are unique. So that being said, and another aspect would be, I would say, our office at that time, because today's I2O was the IPTO and Information Technology Office of that period. It has gone in and out in terms of computer hardware and software. Today, this office is really focused on software, right, which is, I think, an understandable emphasis. To look at what we're doing now, I can only think of, here's a few programs to sort of ponder. One is, from a software development point of view, is can we take a view on open source software in the similar way we view sort of big data, and people have coined the term big code. For, code.
Oh, big code. Yeah.
And that there's, close to 1 trillion lines of code in open source software. How can we be more efficient in an automated manner to mine it, be able to actually get to the point where we can do almost an autocomplete for software development? And that one has a very interesting, I think, trajectory. One thing that is sort of maybe somewhat reassuring that we're on a good track there is that we actually have some folks from Silicon Valley who've come to we have these periodic meetings of the various performers and principal investigators wanting to track how that one might play out. Yeah. And then the other side would be on software. By the way, that program is called Muse, for Mining and Understanding Software Enclaves. And then another one is this whole challenge of the brittleness of software. When you make a change in the underlying ecosystem that supports the program, you'd hate to have it just stops, right? The program, and efforts a tremendous amount of time, it can be on year-long timelines, to now make it compatible, and this you see with Linux as an example. So we have a program just started by the same program manager. This is Professor Suresh Jagannathan, who comes to DARPA from Purdue University. And he's, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I was just, you get me going.
So how big is DARPA now? $3 to $4 billion a year? Is that?
It's about $3 billion. It's actually $2.9 billion annual budget.
And of that, how much is dark classified and how much of it is open?
Oh, geez.
Is it half? Is that
oh,
just
no.
ballpark?
I honestly don't know. So we do have classified work. I would say it definitely is not the bulk of it.
Okay,
it
so
definitely
more
is.
open than closed.
Absolutely, and I think that's been a very positive change, particularly in our office where we actually do most of our programs with open source. There can be difficulties if it gets classified, but open source is our general approach to it. And we actually put on our website, we have an open catalog where you can go and you peruse a table, and then there's tabs for each program on software and publications, and most have software there you can download.
And are there communities that have emerged around DARPA programs, open source?
We need to track that better, but we have seen cases where things have been downloaded, and then unbeknownst to us, they come back and say, we've been able to take what you've done. I think that's just beginning, and I think that awareness is building. And it is one way, certainly, that you can transition into the community. Yeah.
So you've had several tours at DARPA.
Oh, two.
Two tours. Yeah. Were you there during the Tony Tether era?
I was.
So
I survived.
Feel free to correct me, but I find the evolution of DARPA from Tony Tether, who from the outside, he looked like he was a guy who was he had a reputation as a micromanager. He also came from the traditional, he was educated at Stanford, and during the height of the Vietnam War, he was here as an electrical engineer. But then, he spent his career in the aerospace industry, the defense industry. Then he took over DARPA under the Bush administration. Then there was this sort of arc. Regina Dugan came. Yeah. She also had a background in the defense industry. Now it's Arti Prabhakar. And Arti, who also has had, a physicist who's had several tours at DARPA, really is sort of Silicon Valley. And I just wondered, from your past tour at DARPA to your current, is the culture changed because of sort of a Silicon Valley perspective, or is DARPA?
So there's a little bit of both, right? DARPA actually really sustains itself. It's now coming up on 60 years, and there really is a culture to DARPA, this whole aspect of the business model where you have not only program managers, who really are technology entrepreneurs, although we'll never get that title changed at the agency, and myself, we're there for a finite period of time. So that churn tends to be rather independent, whoever is the director, and so you move on, challenging, looking for profound problems to solve, understanding the current state.
These are called DARPA hard, right? Isn't that the...
Well, what Arthi likes to call it is DARPA impact, because a lot of things are hard, right? But, DARPA impact, and that means sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to be an absolute sort of very challenging, high-risk type of technology. It may be of such significant impact that DARPA may be the only one that should take it on.
Yeah. And, there was a period where, and it was during the Iraq War, Dr. Tether may have been quite justified in this, but he really sort of took the agency away from the university community, and that caused a lot of screaming in the university community. My sense is that DARPA's repaired its relationship with...
My sense is certainly that's the case. And we see it was quite profoundly in the area of computer science and what our office tends to be concerned with. It wasn't that universities were excluded. What Dr. Tether chose to impose was this very strict sort of go, no-go. He became well known for that in our programs. I think it serves well when you're looking towards developing a more advanced system. And so you want to understand, and his objective was, well, when do I pull the plug? Because in terms of funding. And are we going down a dead end, et cetera. Whereas when you look at more universities, even more basic research type opportunities, you need to allow a little more playing in the sandbox. But I can say that there were cases where the go-no-goes were not, it was a no-go, and he did go forward because he recognized the value of it.
One of the dramatic things he did that maybe people don't sort of know the arc of this is that he created this particular grand challenge. I mean, there were several grand challenges under his tenure, but the one that focused on autonomous vehicles, led directly to Google's work. And Google, of course, touched off a firestorm in the automotive industry generally as they all rushed to Silicon Valley to not be pushed aside. But I wanted to ask you actually about the next one, the Darpa Robotics Challenge, which is now just concluded. And what's the view within the agency about the impact of that one? Do you think it might have a kind of impact on the world that the autonomous vehicle challenge had?
I think it will. I think So, Darpa Robotics Challenge, for those of you who are unaware, took place in June of this year. This was inspired by the disaster at Fukushima, where you had the tsunami that hit the Japanese coast, took out the reactors there. And what we find is that the reactor complex was, of course, designed for human beings to access all the various parts of the complex, going down ladders, through doors. And so we really, the thought was we had robots, and these are all teleoperated systems, but they were not really capable of accessing the critical parts of the reactor power plant. So Gil Pratt, a program manager at Darpa, said, let's start a challenge where we can now get humanoid-type robots, again, two-legged robots, arms, who could actually do what a human could do. And let's see what we can do to push the community. So we had, I think, around at least 10 teams, I think perhaps a little more. It came down to a set of tests that each team's robot had to go through, such as driving a cart up to a point, getting out of a cart, opening a door. And there's some very nice videos online that show all these robots falling. So any image of Terminator, it's pretty dispelled by at least that. But anyway, the winning team was from South Korea, and second place was an American team from Florida, followed third from Carnegie Mellon. I think you're seeing advances there. These were not autonomous systems. These were teleoperated with some degree of autonomy, such as the robots had to stabilize themselves. I saw more clearly with the self-driving vehicles. Of course, that's the problem. I have hindsight right now. I see what Google's doing. But I couldn't tell you exactly what at this point, but that's okay.
I actually covered all 5 of those events, and I was actually kind of disappointed. You had 3 self-driving car challenges over a 2.5-year period or 3-year period.
That's correct.
And you only had 2.
I know.
And there were actually 24 teams, and only 3 robots completed the 8 tasks perfectly, and they took 50 minutes and 10 minutes. And I thought, well, we're only halfway there. Darpa sort of didn't. And I ran into one of the kids on the Florida team, actually the team who took second, who suggested a third contest for Darpa, which would have been to turn the robots loose in a fictional city, and they'd have to ask humans for directions to get somewhere and get something done.
That'd be great.
Where is Darpa with grand challenges?
So in general, our next one is what we're calling a Cyber Grand Challenge. So it's a whole different type of, let's say, it's not as physical as you had with the Darpa Robotics Challenge or the Grand Challenge and Urban Challenge with vehicles. Cyber Grand Challenge is asking the question, can we really engage cyber attackers on machine time? So what that means is you look at an example. There's a very well-known hacker conference in Las Vegas called DEF CON. It was the 23rd DEF CON was held this year. And they have a competition. It's called Capture the Flag, where teams of human programmers, actually the best in the world, come and compete to capture the flag of an opposing team. In this case, the flag are files on the team's computers, so they have to protect theirs. And then, of course, they are to get the files of an opposing team. The question is, can we actually have a machine, a computer system, do what those human teams do? And the idea there was, let's see if we can get to the point where we could give various teams, and by the way, this started over a year ago with 100 teams throughout the world participating. We've now down to 7 finalists who are now marching towards the final event to take place on the day before DEF CON next year. And what we tested them on in June was we gave them about close to 150 modules of software that had flaws put into them. And then the challenge was for them, in a hands-off manner, their software had to then check to see where the vulnerabilities were and then self-patch. And we got enough progress to say this is worth going forward. So this is an interesting, it's a much less physical. We actually are going to set it up, though, with DEF CON, with a particular, in front of that particular community.
Yeah. And it will happen in the next DEF CON?
It will happen at next DEF CON in Las Vegas at the Paris Hotel.
So step back a little bit. Computer security issues continue to be profound. I mean, I think, so if you go all the way back in history, and you go to the very dawn of the ARPANET in 1969, October 29th, 1969, the original sort of connection between Menlo Park and Southern California, the person in Southern California typed LOG, and then the computer crashed on G, and it crashed because of this technical error called a buffer overflow, which has become a real sort of, it has continued to plague the computer industry for all this time since then. Are you very optimistic that progress can be made?
Oh, absolutely.
That we can have more secure systems?
At least with respect to buffer overflows. It is the same. Yeah.
Which is, it's actually...
It is a big step.
Big problem.
Absolutely. Actually, I believe Microsoft's Windows 10 is going to incorporate certain capabilities to help mitigate that.
Did DARPA play a role in?
Yes, there's this aspect of randomization of memory. And more recently, we've been looking at additional type of, basically taking a page from nature, saying, nature really, you can have problems with a monoculture. And that's what you see with a lot of computers, well, at least pretty much up to the present day, where a program, when it's loaded on your computer and mine, it is instantiated in memory exactly the same way, including how you use your buffer. And so an attacker, again, only needs to master one, overcome the issues on one computer, and has access to millions. Yeah. So just as in nature, you can have in agricultural fields all one crop, and one pest will come in and can wipe it all out. So heterogeneous diversity actually plays a very important role. So these are things that are getting actually into commercial software. I would say there is another interesting level when you get, assuming, let's say, we solve those types of vulnerabilities. One that we are looking at now is, so what might be another sort of potential vulnerability? And one can be in this category of the actual algorithm itself can have assumptions that could be a vulnerability. So I may have a sorting algorithm as one example. And the sorting algorithm, to take something very basic, I go to a bowling alley, right? I give my driver's license to get shoes. And so the organization of how they sort of store the driver's license could be by the first letter of my last name. And so, or anyone's last name for that matter. So that works fine when you're assuming a sort of a pretty nice even distribution of individuals with last names. But if it's a Pierce family reunion, we all show up, we all have the same last name. Now I'll fill that box with Pierce driver's license. And then when we all come back, actually now we have created a bottleneck in the system. The coding could be perfect, but now the algorithm itself becomes now a potential vulnerability that could be exploited to either, like a denial of service type of attack. So we actually have started a program called Space and Time Analysis for Cybersecurity, where space is memory, time is time. And the idea is that looking for, in code, algorithms that might have this kind of vulnerability where you could tie up memory or tie up the resource in time.
So I wanted to drill down on a couple of the programs you talked about, because I want to see how they translate out into the world for people to work on them. And Memex is a great one to start with, because Memex was a term coined by Vannevar Bush, a physicist, but it was really what Doug Engelbart set out to build. He called it the online system, but it was a computerized version of Memex. Memex, I think, was done originally in microfiche cards. And the online system really was sort of the architecture of what became personal computing and the modern internet sometimes. So there's this wonderful thread. So what was missing in those tools that your new Memex is going to do? And will it get out into the world as open source? And are there things that people will be able to do with this?
Oh, so of course the big difference is the the internet
is there now.
is there, hyperlinks
Yeah.
and the whole bit.
Yeah.
But in terms of, very quickly answer your question, yes, Memex is on the open catalog, and you can peruse the library of software and publications associated with it. The software is not maintained, but it's there for those who seek to exploit the advances being made under Memex. Now, Memex was really driven by the need and interest to be able to drill down deep, to do what they call a domain-specific type search, where if you stay within the confines of a Google-type search, which tends to feature breadth, pulling associations of keywords, etc., you have to sort of go through all those pages to pull out what you might be interested in following up. And then you'll go to a particular, follow a link, you come up on other links, you'd like to have a more automated fashion of doing this. So one of the outcomes of Memex, of course, is not only exploring this aspect of the dark, the deep web, but it's being able to give a search term or an interest. Let's say you're interested in autonomy. And actually we did this for a sister agency. Department of Defense was interested. We'd like to learn more about autonomy. So what we did was we then have a machine learning capability which learns from how a human might go about searching, and then was able then to put together an automated domain-specific type search in this regard.
Could you see a commercial product that
Absolutely.
could be derived from this?
Oh, yeah.
So basically, what's the reality is that people very rarely get off the first page of their search results.
That's
and so
correct.
there's all kinds of stuff that's not recovered
That's
there.
correct.
And there are extraction ideas in Memex that
That's
would
correct.
bubble that to the surface.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, by keeping that focus and also helping you in an automated fashion. The other interesting aspect of Memex is that it will look at, it also can pull in unstructured type of, so what that means, there might be a PDF file or an image that is related to my search. I can also extract that and make that part of this this deep dive, really.
There's also a program in your, I believe it's in your organization that you didn't talk about that I'm curious about and it might be of interest to people. Big Mechanism.
Oh, yeah.
Could you describe
Sure.
Big Mechanism?
I think it's very relevant to this summit. Stepping back a bit, we look at this issue of in data analytics, and correlation is a very powerful thing to use. We also we're aware of where correlation can lead to maybe perhaps misleading or incorrect type of conclusions. And there's a particular website, I can't recall it, but you can find all kinds of interesting, really spurious type correlations. And one very good correlation is that the per capita consumption of margarine in the United States correlates like 0.993 with the divorce rate in the state of Maine. So obviously the answer is we just switch everybody to butter and there's going to be marital bliss in Maine. So that's one example, maybe a little trite, but so we would like to get more towards causation. And so playing off of big data, we have Big Mechanism. Can we look at more automated generation of causal models? And what Big Mechanism is starting with, it's picking a rather complex problem. It's the RAS mechanism for cancer. So RAS is a particular protein that gets switched on and then can wreak havoc in many ways, and it's a very complicated set of reaction pathways. There's thousands of scientific and technical papers that are looking at specific parts of that mechanism. And in the old days where the human scholar could try to absorb all that literature and then now start to make insightful changes to the model is very difficult. How can we apply machine learning to actually read thousands of papers, and we're at tens of thousands now, that can take that, pull that information in. Of course, this is unstructured, so you're looking at how you need some human help here at that point. But once you get it in structured form, that allows you now to do the data type analytics, you can start to now make, in an automated fashion, amendments and modify the model. And we've already seen some very interesting expansion of the complexity of this particular RAS system.
Has science? I mean, have scientific papers emerged based on Big Mechanism as
It's starting to. Actually, Paul Cohen, some of you may know him. He's a professor at University of Arizona. He's at Darpa as a program manager. He himself has a paper in Science talking about Big Mechanism. But in addition, of course, he'll talk about it in a very nice way. Obviously, then there's some papers appearing now on that area. I mean, it does suggest a whole new way of doing scholarship and research. Of course, it doesn't necessarily confine to cancer biology.
And is it a visualization tool, or does it allow you to see relations you might have missed?
This is a way to, in an automated fashion, actually start to build the model from scientific papers. Now, where you'd like to go next is from the data itself, not from the written papers on it. But you can see where this is headed, where I know I can gain much deeper explanatory power of these complex phenomena. And that is a very interesting path in terms of also looking at where you might do interventions. In fact, this has already been used to look at one particular type of drug intervention, and by understanding the interplay of all the different, the newfound sort of reaction connections, it's turned out to give some interesting results. So
it's completely generalizable. You could take any body of any corpus.
Well, right now that is the intent, but it is right now focused on. I don't want to sell it for more than what it is.
Yeah.
But yes, that's the intent. In fact, you see some parallel efforts. I think I saw a recent paper in Nature was on paleontology, helping to. There, the intent was not necessarily building a model. It was just how do I take in all this information that exists in these technical papers to help the researchers get their hands around it.
Yeah.
You know.
So you talked about these terms that have a lot of tension between them: transparency of information, privacy, and security. And I wonder if we could explore that for me, because I worry about the tools that you're developing. Used in one context mean one thing and have one power, and used in another context can have an. I believe, for example, that the reason that Europeans have a very different sort of cultural notion of privacy and the internet is because when the Germans got to Paris, the first thing they did was go to the post office and look for the telephone directory. And so that these tools that are so powerful in the context of a liberal democracy in a different setting, and use this open source technology, this technology will get out into the world, can have a very different use. And
yes.
I know Brandeis probably is a way to deal with that, but I mean, how do you frame that kind of a problem?
Well, certainly Tim O'Reilly made the point there's always these two sides of technology. We're always striving to be cognizant of the context in which we live and consequences. Brandeis is certainly an effort to address that. This aspect of trust in media is one. Again, how do you give to the individual, to the consumer, the ability to have this type of, let's say, capability? But yes, it's not something that we automatically can say we've solved it, but hopefully we can at least contribute to that better informs policy.
Yeah. Another point that came up in Tim's talk that I'd love your perspective on is, he at one point said we need a Moore's Law for healthcare, which is a nice idea. I'm not quite sure how you get there, but I wanted to ask, from inside Darpa, Silicon Valley has a deep religious belief in Moore's Law. Things get faster, and they get cheaper faster. That's sort of gospel in Silicon Valley. And we're just at this interesting juncture where it may not be true that much longer. I mean, maybe DARPA's doing some things to extend Moore's Law, but it looks like it's getting kind of ragged.
I think
There's this argument that the cost of transistors, for example, has stopped falling. And if that's true, that breaks one of the big mechanisms of Moore's Law. Dennard scaling, which is the speed up of computing, stopped in 2005.
Right.
So there are all kinds of reasons. So from the software side, you guys used to get a free ride. I mean, you build a program and it was cheaper and faster, at an accelerating rate. Now, what does it look like?
I think there's this interesting challenge of a coevolution of software and hardware that could now distinguish a product or a capability. And this interesting aspect of what Uber's doing with a full stack or sort of vertical integration, where the play isn't just in the software, it's the whole package, right? It's taking you through to the service that they provide. So are we at a point now where what a discriminator could have been, where someone could have been sloppier in design or even on the software programming because you knew there'd be this next transistor family, right, that's going to be smaller and it's going to be faster. I think it puts an interesting challenge on the designer and how they can bring all these into play, both hardware and software. And in fact, the interesting movement of open source hardware I find intriguing as well.
One last question before I open it up. In the last year, a number of sort of eminent physicists and computer scientists and other individuals have been warning about the potential danger of self-aware machines. Mm-hmm. Elon Musk worries about summoning the demon. they put together a group called the Future of Life organization,
Yes.
foundation, to try to treat the ethical issues. Is DARPA doing anything about, I mean, you're still funding in the AI space, but
Yes.
One, do you think self-aware machines are a possibility within the frame of a decade or 2 decades? Is that, do you see that kind of potential?
I guess it depends how broad you want to define that, the span of their, let's say, capability. I mean, you can take a thermostat, right, is a very narrow form of autonomy,
Yeah.
right? But I think they're, of course, not talking about that almost trivial case. I think we need to begin looking at certainly how do you manage the risk, or first assess it in a methodical way. And we have examples from the past where we've introduced, say, elements of what, of course, this ultimate self-realization, or self-awareness might lead. And you look at digital fly-by-wire as an example on aircraft, where there was a very stepwise manner in terms of they moved from direct mechanical, hydraulic type control of aircraft to now handing it over to a digital system where I press a lever that gets translated into basically ones and zeros that then control the actuator on the wings. Now, that sounds almost, really almost a very minimal type of, but we had a stepwise process. The question will be is how do we do a similar aspect for these types of systems? And we see tied to it is trust in these systems. We are planning to start a program looking at how we might explain, how an AI system explains where it got to its decision. Now, these are all relevant concerns. I think what DARPA wants to do is certainly get it onto a rational sort of plane where we can really start to analyze it and approach it as any problem. We've done so in the past.
DARPA developed a semi-autonomous cruise missile that's now being in advanced development. It's out of DARPA's hands. But it raised lots of questions as we bump up against the possibility of completely autonomous weapons and sort of moving killing decisions from humans to machines. Is there a DARPA view on that? I mean, do you have a view on it?
I would say, first of all, when you look at the services, when they employ these think about these systems, there's this aspect of how can I still keep a human in the loop for those types of decisions. Can I then, if that becomes a challenge because of the distance between the particular weapon system and the individual, to what degree then can I hand over certain types of decisions? How can I assure that it will do what I want it to do within a particular defined box? Now, there is the aspect that you also would like a system that if it is going the wrong direction to also destroy itself, or you want also that kind of capability as well. I'd say these decisions are certainly proceeding very carefully. And you are at an interesting point where now there's technologies that can lend itself certainly to some kind of, let's say, target recognition as an example. But then to what degree can you still pull in a human decision maker, commander in that loop? Yeah.
Let's see if the audience has questions. There's a question in front. We have a microphone. Wait just a second for a microphone.
Thanks. So I worked at the National Science Foundation for a couple of years, and I've thought a lot about how you fund innovation just kind of personally. I'm not a social scientist, so I really don't make any claims about understanding any of this. But I'm wondering, how much does DARPA really understand its model of innovation? Do you think it's effective? Do you even do peer review at all? Or is it really, my impression was it was always kind of a lot of power for the program managers to really shape a vision. But then it makes me wonder, well, that's great because it's fast and you can do things really deeply. And if the person's right, that's great. But what if they're not right? Or how do you know about your return on investment, I guess, broadly?
Yeah. There is no peer review. That's correct. Yet it doesn't mean it's open loop. So a program manager, again, I do like to view them as technology entrepreneurs, and that's the kind of energy you like to bring. But there is a sort of 5-step or 5 set of questions we like to answer, and they're often referred to as the Hjalmar Criteria or Catechism, because George Hjalmar sort of put them down in words and was a former DARPA director. So the first one is so am I addressing a problem that is really significant, that if I'm successful, would I really be able to change things in a revolutionary manner? And I would say when people worked on ARPANET, they probably had no idea of the impact of that. But I don't want to take any, I'm sure Licklider had some pretty good insight there. So that's number one. If that problem isn't significant, and if I can't really change things in that degree, then you don't go any further. Then the second question you ask is, this is important, I grant you that. What is currently being done? That's a tough one to answer. And I think particularly in the space of software, information technology, with so much going on in the world, how do you get an assessment of not necessarily what you see now, because you can go out and survey the marketplace, but where are things going to be 5 years out? Because generally that's the lifetime of a DARPA program. So there you got to do a little work, and it's never going to be complete, but you do your best, right? And off you start. Of course, the next third thing is this potential solution that you think is feasible, does it have a chance of getting to that goal? Why is it going to do what all these current approaches not be able to do? Generally, it has to be a very high-risk type of idea. And so then we proceed, but we do it in a phased manner. Generally, the first phase, you have set the highest risk in the effort as number one. If you don't hit it, you can stop the program. Or you may totally redirect it. I remember a program we had a particular larger system concept. It hinged on one particular component that was assumed to be mature by a certain date. It didn't. We stopped the program and focused on that component. So it's that kind of, let's say, flexibility that I think is very critical. And the willingness to also stop and start something new. Or just wait. It may have been too soon. In terms of what's, the other question is, so what's new now that makes this possible?
Other questions? Over on the far left, far right.
I would say one important to emphasize is DARPA is not an operational entity, meaning we don't have the authority to go off and actually do that, but we can provide technologies. And we have a program, it's called XData, which is all about a tool set for big data type of big data science, actually, visualization, analytics, data ingestion, etc. Those kind of tools can be used by individuals and entities who have the authorities to do such activities. The only thing personally I would say is I don't see the value of us doing countering propaganda with propaganda. I think a counter messaging in that can be very difficult, my personal opinion. I should also mention that later today you're going to have one of the panels, and Chris from the Carter Center will actually be talking about work he's doing in regard to looking at social media and applying analytics in that regard to understand it. So I think I certainly want to recommend his talk. But so.
If counter-propaganda isn't a viable solution in your view, what kind of technological solutions might there be?
I would say, can technology help get deeper understanding of what truly is driving the success here? Does that mean the development of models, social behavior models, etc.? I mean, I leave that to the experts, but that would be from my view as trying to develop technologies or tools to help. Okay.
I wonder if you could say a couple of words about the composition of the groups that execute the programs, and in particular, in light of the focus on privacy and trust and so forth, do you have any social scientists in those groups?
Okay.
In other words...
No, I hear you.
Yeah.
I think this is one reason actually I'm here, is how do we engage more with the community? To what extent do you see social scientists on the various teams that are performing on Brandeis? I honestly don't know. I can find out. And I have to say that I'm not the program manager for that effort. But composition of teams can certainly vary. You can have a lead by a particular company or institution, and they bring in others. DARPA likes to push cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary type of activities, and I think Brandeis certainly falls in that category. The teams can also, we've seen in software, this is a little more tied to software development, but a very collaborative environment because open source certainly encourages that. And so you'll have a program being executed where you have proposers who now supply individuals who then get formed into teams where you could have a team headed by entity X and it's supported by A, B, and C for that matter. But your particular question is, there's nothing that opposes that in terms of the relevance of having a social scientist, others support it. I think there's been some significant consultation with the legal community, as you might imagine, because they have a role to play. The only thing is where DARPA has to always be mindful of, it's not a policy type of place, right? It doesn't set policy. It likes to build technologies that can inform policy. So, but it's open, so thank you.
There's a question there.
Hi. In the area, in your opinion, in the area of big mechanism, what are the private sector companies that you believe are leading that technology? And in that aspect, how is DARPA working with them?
So this is always an ongoing effort because many times private companies might keep proprietary what they're doing in that domain. To my knowledge, we recently became aware of at IBM in San Jose, who've been working along the same lines as Big Mechanism, how they can leverage, in a sense, I think certain medical articles in medical journals apply to particular areas of interest. That's the extent I have knowledge of who else might be doing, and I welcome. DARPA really is hungry to find out who else might be doing things, and there's no better way than interacting here, like in meetings such as this. So,
Margaret, and then in the front.
This really relates back to the question about using social scientists, and it's sort of a question to both of you. But I'm perplexed about what you even mean by trust in this context. So who's trusting whom to do what? And where do citizens' trust of DARPA or of government use of data come into this whole problem? And John, you've written a lot about that, so it shouldn't just be Brian answering that question.
I'll let John.
Well, the trust has when you talk about computer architecture, trust has a very formal method, meaning that has nothing to do with the way you think about trust in a community or in a social sense, although that architecture could inform a trusted community. For example, you could think about building a community of people who didn't know each other and creating digital mechanisms to make it possible to trust things like identity, for example.
Well, sure. And I have to say that the trust I referred to with the particular program called Media Forensics was, I would admit, say very narrow. I mean, it's looking at trust in media and going even a little further. What's the integrity, let's say, of this image? And it's broken down into digital, physical, and semantic, where digital is referring to perhaps pixel manipulations, was there cut and paste? Can I detect that? Now, it may be benign. It may, but you may want to know that there was some alteration of the image. Then the next step would be, is the physical scene as shown in the image, is it consistent? And it's well known, you can look at, for example, shadowing, indicating an illumination source, say, up here, and another part of the image might have an illumination source down here. There's something that's not consistent with the totality of that particular image. And then asking the question, is that one image consistent with others that you see on the web or elsewhere? And so you're looking at a more global semantic context. That's, when I talked about trust in media, that was it. And I grant you, it doesn't go as deep as perhaps we all would like, but I hope that helps at least clarify that part. Yeah.
One final question, but let me just say it. I attended the Aspen National Security Forum this summer, which basically the national security establishment of the U.S. attends, and I was just dumbfounded because I've been out of the computer security world for 4 or 5 years. To what degree the discussion of social media as a threat to national security dominated the conversation? Absolutely. That was FBI Director Comey spent a complete half hour of an hour interview with Wolf Blitzer on that subject, and there are not easy solutions. A final question up here.
I'm curious to learn more about how DARPA thinks about acquiring talent, because it seems like in the past few months or year, a lot of public institutions like CMU have lost significant portions of their robotics and AI
Sure.
researchers to various private companies like Google and Uber. So I'm curious as to like how does DARPA think about talent in the coming years?
So there's two types of talent, right? There's the talent who provide the people who actually perform on the contracts. One notable one, certainly from DARPA's perspective, was Boston Dynamics, that was successfully building four-legged, two-legged robots. Google loved it, and they bought them, right? And so initially it was perhaps DARPA was not going to have as opportunities for them to serve, or at least compete for programs. That in some sense it's a little bittersweet, but that's a success in some respects from a DARPA point of view. The other kind of talent is the individuals who come to DARPA to actually start new things, start new programs. And that's a continuous issue because we're turning over at 20-25% a year. That's no business can sustain itself on that type of turnover. But for the DARPA model, that's critical. But of course, now you need to keep having people come in with new ideas. They have it's that whole aspect of wanting an entrepreneur. We're always interested in terms of who might be wanting to come and have some time at DARPA in that respect.
We're out of time, so please thank Brian for appearing today, and I'm sure you can speak with him more afterwards.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.